It's hard to believe in such an emergency, but they were letting lifeboats go half full. They knew the ship was sinking, nobody could be that stupid. But they expected the ship on the horizon to come steaming over. But it was the wrong ship. The Californian was 19 miles away, where Captain Stanley Lord waited for coloured rockets. At around 1 a.m. it must finally have dawned on Captain Smith that the rescue upon which the survival of so many depended was not going to materialise. Now boats are being let go full and passengers are beginning to panic. As the senior surviving officer, much credence and publicity was given to the evidence of Second Officer Lightholler.
I did not leave the Titanic, sir. The Titanic left me.
He was evasive in response to pertinent questions at the American and British inquiries. Out to protect first and foremost his own reputation and then that of the White Star Line. At the British inquiry he claimed,
"The Titanic began her turn to port before the lookout rang down from the crow's nest."
How would he have known this? He said he was in his cabin at the time. Lightholler also said at the American inquiry,
"There was no mist 10 minutes before the ship struck the berg."
Flatly contradicting the evidence of the two lookouts. And how would he have known this if he was in his cabin? He also lied about the number of ice warnings received on the bridge, as if to suggest that the iceberg came as a surprise.
"I do not remember any ice warnings being posted on the bridge."
Lightholler, along with second radio operator Harold Bride and ship's baker Charles Joffin, all claimed that after getting off the Titanic, they stayed in the water for up to an hour.
"I was in the water for between half an hour and an hour before I climbed aboard the upturned collapsible. 20 of us spent most of the rest of that night balancing on the upturned boat, while I gave the orders. Lean left and lean right."
This is quite clearly not possible. We know that the sea temperature that night was between 2 and 3 degrees below freezing. Average life expectancy at that temperature between 3 and 4 minutes. This testimony would simply not stand up today. It is quite clearly fabrication. Just before 5:30 on that fateful morning, Captain Stanley Lord woke his radio operator, only to discover that the Titanic had already sunk. He set off at full steam for the wreck site, but of course he was too late. The Carpathia had already arrived and was picking up survivors. Notable amongst these was J. Bruce Ismay, who had slipped into a lifeboat at the last minute. For this he was to pay the price in public shame for the rest of his life. As the Carpathia steamed towards New York, Ismay was supposedly taken to the doctor's cabin and put under sedation. Even so, he managed to find time to send 3 separate telegrams to the White Star's New York office, urging them to hold the Cedric in New York Harbor so that the Titanic's surviving crew members could be taken straight back to Southampton. Hastily organized, the American inquiry failed to ask the right questions. Titanic surviving officers stonewalled, as did Ismay himself. Several experienced sea captains were called to give evidence regarding the wisdom of steaming at full speed through an ice field, but they all said the same thing. Maintaining full speed in the vicinity of ice was perfectly normal, and on the night in question, the icebergs could be seen at between 5 and 6 miles distant. It never occurred to anyone to ask the simple question, in that case, why did the Titanic hit an iceberg? When the surviving crew got back to England, they naturally expected to go straight home to their loved ones. Instead, they were all herded into a railway shed and held for nearly 24 hours before being made to sign pieces of paper. A lot of them were under the impression that they were signing the Official Secrets Act. Was someone trying to suppress something here, some vital piece of information?
Remember what it is you've put your names to. If there's any talk of the ship being swamped in Belfast, or any stories of insurance fraud going on, then there will be 20 years of His Majesty's pleasure awaiting you and no job to come out to when it's over. So, think on this when you see your wives and sweethearts.
Ismay, Lightholler and the other surviving officers all came back to England on the steamship Adriatic. There can be little doubt as to the main subject of conversation on their voyage. They were all to be star witnesses in the forthcoming British inquiry.
Read all about it. Titanic sinks. Read all about it.
Now, it is unlikely that a fraud of such immense proportions could have been undertaken without the collusion of the authorities, notably the British government, as we shall see later when we look at the inquiry. In fact, it makes perfect sense for the government of the day, under Prime Minister Lord Asquith, to have colluded in a cover-up.
You'll never believe what they've just done.
How many?
I'm told 1,500. The position is simply this, Prime Minister. The White Star Line is on the verge of bankruptcy. Now, if White Star were forced to go into liquidation, the Harland and Wolff Yard in Belfast would also be placed in a very precarious position, perhaps even forced to close down. Now, that means that 20,000 men will be laid off, not to mention the effect on all the subsidiary and dependent industries. Quite frankly, it is a political situation we cannot afford, Prime Minister. Alienate the Irish, and we will most certainly lose seats in Belfast. The Fenians, the Republicans, will seize the opportunity. And with our majority gone, we will undoubtedly lose the next election, Prime Minister.
There is the chance of a blunder here of unprecedented proportions.
We are going to have to go along with this, Prime Minister.
I will not see a stain put upon the British government. Not for the White Star Line, not for Holland and Wolff, not for the Irish, and certainly not for the interests of J.P. Morgan.
I would also remind you, Prime Minister, that as part of the arrangement for an American company to acquire the White Star Line, J.P. Morgan agreed that this government could requisition his ships as Royal Naval Reserves should the need arise. I would also remind you, Prime Minister, that the situation in Europe is becoming ever more doubtful. If the White Star Line were to go into liquidation, the major creditor would be J.P. Morgan himself. Now, as both owner and banker, he would certainly exercise his rights to seize his assets. And we would lose all those ships, Prime Minister.
It's a sad day for England when the policies of a British government are dictated by greedy and ruthless businessmen. And if it ever became public, doubtless you have someone in mind to run the show.
Yes. I thought we could bring Mersey out of retirement. He's reliable, he knows how the system works, he's discreet, and he will do what needs to be done.
My son is called to the bar. I would be more comfortable if he were there to keep an eye on things.
Of course, Prime Minister, we'll find employment for him in the Attorney General's office.
Very well, then. But neither I nor the administration know anything about it.
Prime Minister.
So, the Board of Trade inquiry was to be conducted by Lord Mersey, President of the Board of Trade and no stranger to the art of cover-up. Since the enormous loss of life was in part due to outdated Board of Trade regulations regarding the number of lifeboats to be carried by ships and the safety of ships at sea generally, it was hardly likely that the inquiry was going to be too concerned with uncovering the truth, the Board of Trade being both plaintiff and defendant in the case. The hearings were held at the Scottish Drill Hall in London, where the acoustics were so bad that spectators in the public galleries found it difficult to hear everything that was said. Lord Mersey had complained about the unfortunate choice of venue, but then again it had been booked by his son. Harold Sanderson, representing Harland and Wolff, repeatedly made the mistake of referring to the Titanic as the Olympic. As for Lord Mersey himself, he simply didn't ask or allow to be asked the right questions. The press, who were there throughout the hearings and could have done something about it, were more interested in the scandal surrounding the lucky escape of J. Bruce Ismay. Other expert naval officers told Lord Mersey that even on a moonless night there'd be no difficulty spotting an iceberg from as far away as 6 or even 10 miles. Remember, the full turning circle of the Titanic at top speed was only 3/4 of a mile. The whole British inquiry was a whitewash. Captain Smith would not be blamed because he was no longer alive and could not defend himself. The lookouts were not to blame. The design and construction of the Titanic was not to blame. Neither were her officers or her owners. In fact, no one was to blame, except Captain Lord. Captain Lord stood alone. If Lord Mersey heard anything at the inquiry that he didn't like, he simply ignored it.
She looked like a small tramp steamer about 5 miles away. They were firing rockets just after midnight. Altogether, she fired 8 rockets, and all white, and rose no further than the masthead.
I think we are all of the opinion that the distress signals, which were seen from the deck of the Californian, were in fact the distress signals from the Titanic.
I went down below to Captain Lord, who was sleeping in the chart room. He asked me again if I was sure there was no color in the rockets. So I said, no, they were all white.
I think the onus of proof in this matter is upon the Californian. That it will be for the Californian to satisfy us that they were not the signals of the Titanic.
Whenever a Titanic survivor referred to the mystery ship that they'd seen on the horizon, as often as not, Lord Mersey would interject with,
"You mean the Californian?"
There was barely an attempt at cross-examination, and, as happened so often, Captain Lord declined to defend himself. Perhaps out of fear that he might reveal his part in the conspiracy. Furthermore, when the inquiry heard from passengers who'd been aboard the Mount Temple that they'd actually seen the Titanic on the horizon and were even close enough to hear the last 2 reports of her rockets, Lord Mersey repeatedly interrupted them.
You do not give me the answers that please me.
Of course, if Lord Mersey was a party to the cover-up, he would have known about Captain Lord's secret mission and of how the rescue plan failed, largely because of circumstances outside Captain Lord's control. And yet, Lord Mersey repeatedly interrupted the testimony of Californian's officers and instead accepted evidence against Captain Lord that would have been laughed out of court under normal circumstances. Was Captain Lord being made a scapegoat because he had failed to do what he'd been engaged to do on the night of the disaster? Of course, by highlighting Lord and the Californian, Lord Mersey was drawing attention away from rather more sensitive issues. Titanic's bulkheads should have gone 1 deck higher. It was the Board of Trade's own regulations that allowed Titanic to go to sea with too few lifeboats, and the Board of Trade's inspectors who had been so ready to sign the ship off as fit to go to sea in the first place. Titanic cost $10 million to build, and as a brand new ship, would have been insurable for that amount and more. The Olympic, on the other hand, damaged beyond economic repair, would only have been insurable for a much smaller amount. A motive for switching the ships is clear. Normally, White Star Line, when they insured their ships, took on part of the risk themselves, and it was at first thought that Lloyd's of London would only be liable for $7.5 million. Not so. For just 1 week before the maiden voyage of the Titanic, which we now know was in fact the Olympic, White Star Line upped their insurance on the vessel dramatically. And, incredibly, just 5 days after the sinking, Lloyd's paid out $12.5 million. Although 3/4 of a century at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean did not exactly preserve Titanic in museum-like condition, there is enough left of the wreck to give us more than just an idea of what really happened. Corrosion has done its relentless work, but where the original black paint of the hull has flaked away, it is still possible to see spots of grey paint, which formed the undercoat, except that grey paint was only used as an undercoat on the Olympic and not on the Titanic. Examination of the starboard propeller reveals the number 01 stamped into the metal. In fairness, there is too much corrosion to make out the number 4 clearly, but remember the starboard propeller, numbered 401 for the Titanic, was put on the Olympic as part of the repairs after the collision with the Hawk. Remote cameras under the control of the discoverer of the Titanic wreck, Dr. Robert Ballard, have examined the stern section of the ship. They show that in addition to the lateral bulkheads that were a feature of both the Titanic and the Olympic, there is a longitudinal bulkhead in the stern section where there was none on the original plans for either vessel. The position of this bulkhead suggests a temporary repair has been carried out to strengthen the keel, a keel perhaps damaged by the collision with HMS Hawk. And finally, a close look at the bow could reveal the most damning evidence of all. In 1986, the French National Oceanographic Institute examined the wreck with Dr. Robert Ballard. One of the things they checked was the name of the ship. In keeping with White Star tradition, both ships had their names engraved into the upper bow plates in letters 4 foot high. Examination of the wreck and the name Titanic shows that it is made of iron letters which have been riveted onto the original bow plates. With the passage of time, 2 of the letters have dropped off and been lost forever in the sediment of the seabed. At the place where they once were, engraved into the hull, are the letters M and P.